Morning everyone. This is the last section in the DNA and genetic diversity booklet from page 29 onwards. So genetic diversity and adaptation in the notes. And we're going to describe what genetic diversity is, the process of natural selection, and then explain and compare the differences between directional selection and stabilising selection. Okay then. So to begin, a definition. So genetic diversity is the number of different alleles of genes in a population. Now this has come up on exam questions a few times. Here's an example of a mark scheme here from one of the recent AQA biology exams, A-level exams. So genetic diversity are the differences in the DNA or the differences in the base sequence of DNA. So that essentially means the same as the different alleles. Okay, but accepted would be the number of different alleles of genes in a population. So we're looking here to compare when comparing genetic diversity, we're comparing the different alleles, really important here, we're comparing the number of different alleles of genes in a population. So where a population represents a number of individuals of the same species in a given habitat area, etc. Okay, so all of those organisms in the same species have the same genes. Okay, now they might have the same genes, however, they may have different versions of those genes, alternative versions of those genes, which are known as the alleles. And those alleles, if you think back to all of the work that we've been doing on DNA and genetic diversity, they are determined by the differences in the nucleotide base sequence of DNA. Okay, so if you were trying to define that, I think the easiest thing to say is the number of different alleles of genes in a population. So there are some factors which will affect the survival of a species or affect the survival of a population, and they include environmental change, the emergence of a new disease, a new predator, or perhaps a new competitor. So a competitor is something that is competing for a limited resource in that habitat. Now within a population, we see, obviously all of these are the same species. These are peccaries. Come back to these later on, but they have, sorry, they're not peccaries, are they? I think they're warthogs. Anyway, they have variation. So there is a variation of phenotypes, the physical expression of the genotypes. And we can see that in this population here. All of the alleles in that population combine to form the gene pool. So a population with a greater number of alleles, so a greater number of different versions of a particular gene, has a greater genetic diversity, and obviously that would be reflected by a larger gene pool. Okay, so what is the benefit of that then? Having a greater genetic diversity means that there will be individuals within the population that are better adapted to survive a particular change. So maybe that change is the environmental change or the new disease or predator or new competitor. those that are better adapted to survive are able to reproduce more. So if they reproduce more, they pass on the advantageous alleles that make them better adapted more often. So the allele which gives them that sometimes what we call a selective advantage. If they possess that allele that gives them the selective advantage just means that they're better adapted to survive a particular change. If they have that allele, they will reproduce more often. They reproduce more often and for longer, so i.e. they reproduce more. They'll pass on more of those advantageous alleles. Now it's really important here that we are referring to alleles, because remember, if you think back to the original slide, they all have the same genes. Genes is too vague here. We're talking about the inheritance of the passing on of an allele, a particular version of a gene that gives them that selective advantage. Okay. So I've got to give Mr. McKee a lot of credit for these PowerPoints that I'm using. And one of the slides that she's included here are some extra reading that you could do. Well, as we're in lockdown at the moment, perhaps you might want to get copies of some of these books. They talk about evolution. Obviously, the one you've probably all heard of by Charles Darwin is On the Origin of Species, where Darwin first puts across his ideas about natural selection being the driving force for evolution. Published in 1859. At the same time, another biologist, probably heard of this one, Alfred Russel Wallace, not Alfred. Alfred Russel Wallace had independently come up with similar ideas on the passing of advantageous alleles and increased reproductive success as a way of explaining natural selection and evolution. Steve Jones, a more contemporary biologist, as an example there. So this is a sort of a reflection on the origin of species, more recent. Both of these books talk about the observations that Darwin made and Alfred Russel Wallace, and the conclusions that they used or that they drew from those observations. So, one is there is an overproduction of offspring. That means when animals reproduce, they tend to reproduce more, a greater number than would be necessary to maintain the size of the population. I.e., when two organisms reproduce, they may have a litter, for example, or may have 5, 6, 7 offspring. Okay, this is what we refer to as the overproduction of offspring. However, another observation that Darwin made was that there was this constancy of numbers. So, despite this overproduction of offspring, the actual size of these populations tended to remain roughly stable. And the reason for that, one of the what he gathered from those two observations was there was a struggle for existence. And by that, existence means essentially survival. That there were some organisms would struggle to survive and struggle to survive for long enough to reproduce. And therefore, that overproduction can be explained or the constancy of numbers, despite the overproduction, can be explained for by this struggle for existence. There is competition between the individuals within a species, and then there's things like predation and disease, which might mean that some of those individuals that were born die, and the numbers in a population remain the same. Darwin also noted great variation among species. So within the species, there may be a big diversity, a big variation of phenotypes. This leads to this idea of the survival of the fittest. Now, survival of the fittest isn't sometimes wrongly attributed to Darwin. It's actually Herbert Spencer who made this comment about 5 years after the publication of The Origin of Species, but it's quite a nice way of thinking about it, so that the organisms with the selective advantage that we mentioned earlier on, so they are the ones that are better adapted to survive a change. They reproduce more often. If they reproduce more often, their alleles are passed on more frequently. And that is a rough explanation of natural selection. Now, natural selection over many generations and over a really long time period can lead to evolution. Okay. So, a bit more detail then on natural selection. Oh, go away, I don't need to know. Okay. So, if you're ever given a question on explaining natural selection, we need to include these 5 points. It's important, though, that the context of the question is included. I may do a follow-up video on this to look at an example, but this is the sort of the general format that you should follow. So there is variation in a population due to random mutations. I think back to those previous videos that we've watched. Mutations lead to the emergence of new alleles. That new allele provides a new phenotype. So phenotype, remember, is the physical expression of a gene with the influence of the environment as well. Now, those new alleles, well, they may be harmful, and that would lower the reproductive success, so it reduce the number of times that organism can reproduce. Or they may be neutral, they may have no effect on the rate at which those individuals reproduce, or in some cases, and actually most rarely, they can be beneficial. Now, the beneficial ones mean that if there is a change in the environment, organisms with advantageous alleles, so alleles that allow them to be better adapted to the change in the environment, are selected for. And by selected for, we mean they survive and reproduce. So organisms with that advantageous allele and the phenotype that results are able to survive longer, reproduce more often, and pass on that allele. Those without that beneficial, that advantageous allele, do not. This brings up this idea of differential reproductive success. Differential reproductive success means that some reproduce more often than others and for longer, and therefore pass on more of their alleles, pass on more of those advantageous alleles. Over many generations, the frequency of the advantageous alleles will increase. Now, those 5 points will get you the 5 marks probably in any natural selection question. But it's really important to include from the stem of the question, in most cases anyway, the context. So the question may give reference to a particular allele or a particular phenotype, and you should include that context in your responses. Okay, so let's move on. These curves, this is called a normal distribution, and we see this really often in biology when we are looking across a population at the particular characteristics or phenotypes. And when we measure those phenotypes and we measure the frequency of those phenotypes in a population. Now this is a case when the phenotype is continuous, it can be given a value, and there are intermediate values between each point. So we get this continuous characteristic or continuous phenotype, such as the height or mass of an organism. So here we've recorded the frequency that each of those phenotypes appears in a population. And what we tend to find is there are fewer of those individuals at the extremes of this phenotype or characteristic, and there are more at the mean. And it's a very common normal distribution, sometimes referred to as the bell-shaped curve, and we see that really often. So when we're measuring a population, it's possible to create this normal distribution. Now it's important to understand this when we want to look at, or when we want to look at natural selection and perhaps evolution, because this is one way that we can view the changes in a population. So another feature that's important to understand is this idea of standard deviation. Okay, now standard deviation comes up a lot in biology. It's one of the mathematical tools that we use when we're comparing populations. Now, standard deviation isn't a statistical test, but in some biology questions it plays the role of a statistical test. It's a way of comparing perhaps two populations. Now, the standard deviation is the spread of data on either side of the mean. So here we have two normal distributions from two different populations. On the left, so that's number one and number two. So on the left, number one, we can see there is a small standard deviation. So that means there is a greater proportion of the population with a characteristic, a phenotype, which is close to the mean value. Okay, there's a much smaller range or spread of data either side of that mean. Population number two here, we can see there is a greater spread of data. Okay, so there are more individuals at the extremes of this phenotype, and there's a greater number of, greater spread of that data. Okay. Now this is important because we can use these normal distributions and the standard deviation to compare populations and perhaps look at what happens after there has been natural selection. Let's give an example of the first type of natural selection. So natural selection can be divided into, well, there are actually three types we talk about on the A-level. I'm just going to talk about two today. The third one we come across a bit more in the second year. So directional selection is a type, I suppose, of natural selection. And here is an example. So we've got some questions here. What is the mean fur length in this population. So we can see there is a population of animals. I can't quite remember what they are. That doesn't really matter. And they live in a habitat which has a temperature of 10 degrees Celsius. Now their fur length, their mean fur length, we can find looking here, is 15 millimeters. You see the most, there's the highest frequency at 15 millimeters, so there's an even spread on either side. The second question asks you to predict what would happen to the mean fur length if the average temperature of the environment changed to 5 degrees. So here it's 10 degrees. What would happen if it changed to 5 degrees? Okay, so if the environment changes, it becomes cooler, it would be safe to predict that the fur length may increase. But we need to think about why that is, and we need to use our understanding of natural selection to be able to explain it. Okay, so what can we see? Well, let's look back at the first part of natural selection. Variation present due to random mutations. Let's have a look here. So there is variation in this population due to random mutations. Let's go back. There are alleles which are beneficial after that change in the environment. Now it's important here that we include this idea of context. The context here is the allele which codes for longer fur. So these individuals in this, to the right of the mean with the longer fur, they possess alleles which provide them with the phenotypes to give them longer fur. So they have the advantageous alleles. Okay. Now, if they have the advantageous alleles, that means that they are able to survive and reproduce at that cooler temperature more often. So survive for longer, reproduce more often, and pass on those alleles for longer fur. Okay, so remember we're talking about the context, so they're passing on these alleles for longer fur. Okay, and they pass on those alleles longer fur more often than the individuals with the alleles for shorter fur, or even the individuals with the alleles at that mean. Okay, and this is what we refer to as that differential reproductive success. Okay, so the individuals with the alleles for the longer fur can reproduce more often, survive for longer, pass on more of those alleles. And again, I'll just reiterate, it's really important here that we're talking about alleles being passed on. Okay, over many generations, the frequency of that advantageous allele will increase in the population. Okay, so the frequencies of these alleles for longer fur would increase, and then you could probably predict that the normal distribution, this bell-shaped curve, will move to the right. To the right? Left, right, yeah. Not very good at that. Will move to the right. So the mean fur length would increase. So we've now used the graph. We've explained what would happen if the average temperature decreased. So we've got an environmental change, decrease in temperature. What effect would that have on the fur length? Now these individuals here with the alleles for longer fur reproduce more often, survive for longer, pass on more of those advantageous alleles for longer fur. The frequency of those alleles increases, and eventually the curve would shift to the right, and we would get a new normal distribution. Those individuals down here, well, they are being selected against. Their fur is too short, so they would not survive. And there we go. Okay, now we call this directional selection because, well, we can see that the curve has shifted in one direction. So one of the extreme alleles, or extreme phenotypes really, is selected for. The other extreme phenotype is selected against. That moves that normal distribution, that bell-shaped curve, in one direction. Okay, so this is directional selection. Now, in fact, in most exam questions, you would also get a marking point just for saying this is an example of directional selection. So stick that in. Okay, here we can see that drawn for you. So when the environment is changing, phenotypes at one extreme are selected for. Give the details of how that would happen using this framework. And it selects the organisms with the extreme characteristic, or I prefer phenotype actually to characteristic. Okay, so in this case, they're selecting for the longer fur length as that extreme. Good. Well, I've got another example from an exam question recently. What's happened to my notes? Hold on. Okay, I've lost the mark scheme, but no, that doesn't matter. Okay, so lactose is the main sugar in milk and hydrolyzed by the enzyme lactase. Lactase is essential to newborn mammals as milk is their only source of food. Now, most mammals stop producing lactase when they start feeding on other food sources. Humans are an exception to this because some continue to produce lactase even as adults. The ability to do that is known as lactase persistence and is controlled by a dominant allele. Okay. By the dominant allele, a number of hypotheses based on different selection pressures have been put forward to explain lactase persistence in humans. One hypothesis for lactase persistence in humans suggests that the selective pressure was related to some human populations farming cattle as a source of milk. Okay, so we use the same framework again. Describe how farming cattle as a source of milk could have led to an increase in the lactase persistence. So back to that framework, well, we know there's variation of alleles due to random mutations in the original population. Now, some of those alleles, there will be an allele for lactase persistence. The change in the environment here is the farming practices. Okay, so populations farming cattle and essentially agriculture is that change in the environment, and those populations where farming cattle and milking cattle, it would be advantageous to have the alleles for lactase persistence. Those individuals with the allele for lactase persistence would have greater access to the glucose and galactose from lactose, so they may be able to survive longer, reproduce more often. So we've got this idea of selective reproductive success, differential reproductive success. If those with the lactase persistence allele survive longer, reproduce more, they will pass on more of those alleles to their offspring, and over many generations, the frequency of that lactase persistence allele would increase. Eventually, in some populations, it's not true ever in the world, but in some populations that becomes the dominant feature of that population, and most people in those populations show this lactase persistence. Okay, so what we've done there, we've included the context. The context is the lactase persistence. Variation due to the random mutation, so the allele for lactase persistence was present in the population, and it becomes the beneficial one. Change in the environment is the farming practices. So farming cattle for milk. The advantageous allele, well, if you have the lactase persistence allele, you can break down lactose from the milk into glucose, so it's an extra source of glucose and galactose. They would be selected for, they survive and reproduce more often, pass on the lactase persistent allele. Over many generations, that frequency of that allele increases. Good. Right, the second type of selection we're going to talk about today is stabilising selection. So when the environment is constant, i.e. there's no environmental change, the phenotypes around the mean become selected for. Okay, that excludes the alleles at the extremes. Okay, so the alleles are at the extremes are the disadvantageous ones, and they are selected against. Therefore, the phenotypes at the extremes are selected against, and a greater proportion of the population have alleles which give the phenotype close to the mean. Okay, so using that same example we looked at earlier on, if the optimum fur length for 10 degrees Celsius is 15 millimeters, if the temperature is constant in that environment, it would be advantageous for those individuals with the alleles for that mean phenotype to survive. They survive longer, reproduce more often, pass on more of those alleles to their offspring, compared to the ones at the extreme, which survive less, reproduce less often, and pass on fewer of their alleles. And what we see here then is the standard deviation becomes smaller. Now, this is stabilising selection. Again, use this as a framework for answering that. Okay, use the context if there is one to explain it, and also state the type of selection. So here we've stated that this is stabilising selection. Here we've got, and previously we looked at directional selection. So here we've got another example. What type of selection is this? Well, it's directional selection. That was a peccary. Okay, so this is a peccary. They feed on cacti. Okay, the cacti, to prevent the feeding, so that the cacti are able to survive more and reproduce more often, they produce spines. So, with the introduction of this new, it's not really a predator, is it? But introduction of this species, this peccary, the phenotypes with the greater number of spines are advantageous. So here we can see in the original population there is a range in the number of spines. So there is variation due to random mutations. Okay, the allele that becomes beneficial are those alleles which code for a greater number of spines. They are selected for, and therefore the cacti with a greater number of spines reproduce more successfully, so reproduce more often and for longer, pass on more of the alleles for greater number of spines until the frequency for the greater number of spines increases, and we get this directional selection. Oh dear. Plug the laptop in quickly. Okay. So, and this is an example of directional selection. Okay, let's add another complexity to this. So, another interaction in this habitat might be the introduction of, or when we consider these wasps. So this is a type of wasp, and it lays eggs on the cacti. And when those eggs hatch, they feed on the cacti as well. Now, the wasps lay their eggs at the base of the spines. So if we consider that for a moment, now the cacti has two problems. So there are the parasites, the wasps, laying their eggs at the base of the spines. Well, if there are lots of spines, they'll be able to lay lots of eggs, and those eggs would then feed on the cacti. However, if they have too few spines, the peccaries would be able to feed on the cacti. So they have to find an optimum number of spines. In order to do that, there's a selection pressure against the extremes for fewer spines, and there are also selection pressures for extremes at the greater number of spines. So the mean, not a very straight line, the mean number of spines is selected for, so we know this is a type of stabilising selection. Okay, I think that'll do for this. If you have any questions, feel free to send me an email. Thanks a lot. All the best. Take care of yourselves.